Hello, and welcome to Devlog number 12. The big announcement that I want to make to start off is that we now have an official name for the game, and that is Nebulous Fleet Command. Way back in Devlog number 1, I said that Nebulous was the working title for the game, and I had intended it for it to stay a working title, but when we started shopping around our ideas that we were brainstorming for what we wanted the title to be, interestingly, the reaction that we got a lot was, wait, you guys are getting rid of Nebulous? Why? It's such a cool and interesting name. And I had intended for Nebulous to be only a working title because I didn't really think that it described the game very much, but the more I thought about it and the more people told me, the more I realized that it does kind of describe the game, because in a game where sensors are so important, but also so inaccurate, and the electronic warfare aspect increases the factor of the fog of war that you normally find in strategy games, Nebulous really did start to solidify as a name that actually did describe the game. But we still wanted a title that was gonna actually indicate what the point of the game was, and so we figured Fleet Command was a good subtitle that would make a title that was both poetic and interesting and unique, but also tells you what the product in the tin is. Now, with that out of the way, the focus of the last 2 weeks has been rounding out electronic warfare with a couple of the missing components that I didn't get to in my first sprint that I worked on EW. But the most obvious change is this big ship here, which is the heavy cruiser class that we also added. I mentioned it in the last devlog, and we finished it like we expected to, and I'm really happy with how it turned out. It's meant to be just below the battleship in terms of power. There's going to be a light cruiser and a heavy cruiser. The gimmick of the heavy cruiser is that it mounts a battleship-sized weapon on its dorsal mount, so it has 2 cruiser-sized weapons on top, 1 battleship-sized weapon on the bottom, and it's meant to just be your heavy fleet hitter that doesn't have as much durability as a battleship. And along with this new class comes a couple of new weapons that are suitable for a ship of this size to carry. We have a set of railgun turrets, we have a single barrel and a double barrel, the single barrel being the cruiser-sized variant and the double barrel being the battleship-sized variant. And it does a lot of damage over a very long range. You can basically hit something from all the way across the map with it. It's that accurate, it has that much speed and range. And then we also have a double barrel and a triple barrel conventional cannon, which do a lot of damage up close and have a much faster reload. And as a side note, in case you think something weird is going on here, something weird is going on because I'm controlling all of the ships in this battle. I'm just fighting against myself to give you something interesting to look at. But man, managing 2 fleets is really hard. This is where we're going to draw the line for a little while in terms of adding new classes to the game, because now we have a corvette and a frigate and a destroyer and a cruiser, which kind of rounds out the spectrum of power that we're going to have in the game. We now have a representative from every major utility area in the fleet. So we've got a corvette, which is your fast scouting ship that can deal a little bit of damage. Your frigate is your flexible, cheap utility ship. The destroyer is meant to punch above its weight, and the heavy cruiser is meant to fight other large capital ships. So jumping back in time here, let's talk about these missing E-War components, one of which was passive detection of enemy radars, also known as ELINT. And so this module on the top here is an electronic support module, and so what that does is it allows us to detect the radars of the ships over here from a slightly greater range than they can detect us. So this now gives the players a reason to have to play with the signature management controls down here, so turning off your radars would make you undetectable by this particular sensor. And so when you're in the sensor's view or the tactical view, it shows you a line in the direction that those sensors are. So if I had my radars off and I didn't have tracks on these ships over here, I'd still be able to know what direction they were in, even if I don't have the ability to actually fix them and figure out exactly where they are so I can target them. And the reason that it's an external module rather than just an interior module like the normal radars are is because the ability to detect an enemy by just their emissions is pretty powerful, and so I felt it was a good balancing system to make it so that the player would have to sacrifice weapon slots in order to do this. And this module only provides a 180-degree dome of vision, and so if you really want full 360 coverage to detect enemy radar, then you need to sacrifice 2 slots in order to do that. Also on the subject of electronic warfare was a need to be able to counter jamming in a non-kinetic way. So right now there's already home-on jam missiles, so if someone's jamming you from a direction, you can shoot a couple home-on jam missiles in that direction, and hopefully they'll lock onto the jamming signal, and it kind of makes it so that you can't jam with impunity. But I also added this new component up here on top. This thing is a radar illuminator. Now, this isn't exactly the way that an illuminator works in real life, but it did make a good mechanical counter to jamming that didn't involve actually just shooting at the enemy. And so what this does is it'll saturate an area of space with radio waves and mark that signature as quote-unquote illuminated. It's basically a radar flashlight. What that actually accomplishes is two things. The first is not actually how an illuminator works in real life, but when you're shining an illuminator into an area of space, any signature in there has its return boosted by the amount of power coming out of the illuminator. And so the amount of power in the radar return is now greater than what it would have otherwise been, and so now you have a greater probability of burning through that jamming and being able to see the contact. The second thing that an illuminator gives us is something that I have to demonstrate in a closed environment to really show you it properly, but it's the ability to have semi-active guided missiles, which means that the missile itself doesn't actually emit its own radar signal. It's looking for a return from another source, and that's what our illuminator is going to be. So to demonstrate this, the first thing I'm going to do is fire a missile into this area and show you that it's not going to track any targets. So you can see this missile just cruises right past the enemy ships. Now when I turn on my illuminator and I point it in that direction, I can see that this area of space is now being painted. And with that area painted, when I fire missiles in this general direction, they'll now pick up their target and actually seek towards it. And finally, the last piece of electronic warfare that was really missing was comms jamming. So communications are important in this game because it allows ships to share tracks between each other. So for a setup, this ship has a long-range radar on it which is capable of seeing these ships over here because it has line of sight and the correct radar signature, etc. But let's turn it on to radar only, so it's no longer transmitting those long-range contacts. And if we click on this ship over here, they can no longer see these ships up here. Now if I turn comms back on, they go back to being able to see these tracks because they're being shared. So when I turn on a communications jammer into this area of space, these ships are now having their communications jammed, as you can see up here, which means that these ships down here aren't receiving the tracks from these ones up here. And then when I go ahead and disable this jammer, you'll see that these tracks reappear for the ships down here because the communications have been restored. There's also been plenty of small improvements. I made the over-penetration effects more obvious. There's a big splash of debris and particles so that you can see that it's not just a mistake that this round is passing through. Disabled components now have less sparking and smoking effect on them so that you can see from the outside that this component has been disabled or destroyed. I also finally made it so that damaged or destroyed thrusters actually affect the maneuverability of the ships. So just destroying thrusters will not completely immobilize a ship like destroying the drive module will, but it will make it so that the ship, at worst, if you destroy all the thrusters on a certain side, can only accelerate at 10% of its normal acceleration. Unfortunately, I didn't really get to the intel portion, which was identifying the tracks and making it so that they're not always unknown. But the reason for that is because I'm going to have to do an overhaul of the team system, because right now there can be up to 8 teams. They're just represented by a short, and it doesn't really make sense for a game like this. I realized if you have 3 teams, let's say, and 2 of them meet and one gets eliminated and the other gets crippled, and then the third guy who just happened to not find everyone until later shows up, well, they're obviously going to win because the other person who survived has already expended a lot of their ammunition and received a lot of damage, and it's just not very fair or fun. And so I'm going to make it so there's only really 2 teams, which is going to affect how the intel system would work in the first place in terms of knowing what team has identified which tracks, etc. But that's going to have to hold off for now because I don't really want to do a big overhaul of a core component like how teams work when I'm stuck on my laptop and it's not easy for me to run multiple clients and test the multiplayer easily. So that's going to wait for now. What I really like to start on next is going to be getting AI working, because in this battle I'm controlling all of the ships, and it's very taxing and also kind of hectic. And I really just need to start making it so that single player is actually a viable way to play the game. And AI in this game is going to offer a real challenge, because the ships can be configured however you want, and so the AI is going to need to figure out what each ship is useful for depending on what the player has built a fleet to look like, or maybe the AI will be able to make a certain number of preset fleets. But it's going to be quite a challenge, especially because I've never done any kind of AI programming before. So that's pretty much going to get an entire sprint dedicated to itself next, because it's going to be such a big task to start making a CPU opponent that isn't just completely brain dead and just drives the ships in one direction, so I have a moving target to shoot at. And with that, that concludes my update. Thank you for watching.